from Abuja.
Hello, thank you for being a part of our show. We appreciate you. I'm Magnus Kpakol, and this is Magnus Kpakol GVA, Global Views Africa. As always, it's all about how we can raise the level of living. That's what it's all about. In View today, we look again at falling commodity prices. So far, how are emerging market economies faring? We have more comments from a seminar organized in 2015 by the World Bank and the IMF in Washington, D.C. As we will see once again, the impact has been good and bad, depending on if you primarily sell or buy commodities as a country. And so all this decline in prices, when will it end? Stay tuned for my view. But before that, in our hidden economics, we look again at helicopter politicians. Do we need them in our communities? Now up next, we bring you some information on the largest hotels in the world and also take a look at tourism in Africa. All that coming right up. Perhaps the best way to rank hotels is not so much by exclusivity or location, but more by the number of rooms and on the capacity to house large contingents of guests without compromising comfort or the quality of service. In this connection, which of the following listed hotels is the largest in the world? First World Hotel in Malaysia, the MGM Grand and Signature in Las Vegas, Disney All-Star Resorts in Orlando, and Ismailovo Hotel in Moscow. Tourism represents 9% of global GDP and provides 1 in 11 jobs worldwide. It has become an important revenue source for several countries in Africa. Indeed, over the last few years, Africa has experienced a massive increase in the tourism industry. This apparent boom has been fairly resilient in spite of many of the recent challenges that the continent has faced in disease epidemics and conflict. In this connection, which of the following countries is not among the top 4 in Africa in tourism destination? Kenya, Egypt, Morocco, and South Africa. Stay with us for our answers coming up shortly. Still in view, governance and economic activity. As we've said before, what Africa needs is modern contemporary skills for effective job creation and global competitiveness. But up next in our hidden economics, helicopter political leadership. Too much hovering with little contact. As we said last time, if we're going to build our communities, we'll have to do it with commitment. The political leader cannot succeed with any community transformation without properly and directly engaging the community. Although political leadership is supposed to be about using power and position to connect with people and improve upon their economic conditions, sometimes the politician in some developing countries seems to be about grandstanding by hovering over the people like a helicopter. They rarely really bring about any well thought through clear designs for holistic community development. When I talk of helicopter leadership, I'm talking about something a little bit different from that seen with helicopter parents, where parents hover over their kids, sometimes in their schools or on the playground, to so to speak rescue them from any trouble. These parents are loving micromanagers of their kids, literally overseeing whatever the kids do. Unlike helicopter parents, helicopter politicians appear as though they are ready to help take care of their constituency. They appear ready to rescue them, but instead generally just hover above. Many leaders resort to the helicopter style because they hope that the people will be impressed by this posturing and therefore become loyal to them. It appears that some helicopter leaders hope that if they do enough for people, they will become dependent and accept to be on their political leash. As it has happened in many places, excessive helicopter leadership can result in a hostile dependency, where the people receiving the help end up feeling angry at themselves for needing the help and then often become resentful of the leader for not even giving me enough. Political leaders would do well to avoid being sucked into helicopter leadership. What we need are clear and holistic economic strategies for our communities. A politician who is not able to do this may soon be found to be disappointing. When you hear people saying, "He betrayed me," it is often a result of a helicopter relationship where the helicopter has even crashed and its pilot is no longer that important. For an enduring relationship, the political leader should be committed and from the start and strive to use a dimension that involves motivation and practical solutions that make people economically viable today and tomorrow. Our hidden economics for you. Before we start our discussion in view, here are our quick view answers. Ismailova Hotel in Moscow, with 7,500 rooms, is the largest hotel in the world. Kenya is the country listed here not among the top 4 tourism destinations in Africa. To contact us for adverts and sponsorship, please see our information displayed on the screen. The ongoing sharp decline in commodity prices has inflicted a heavy toll on many African and other emerging market countries. Recently, the IMF and the World Bank had a seminar on the subject in Washington, D.C. With Javier Blas of Bloomberg News moderating, the seminar looked into the differential impacts of falling commodity prices on emerging market economies. Today, we continue our discussion from last time with Mr. Mauricio Cardenas, Minister of Finance of Colombia, and Dr. Mohamed Laksaki, Governor of the Central Bank of Algeria. Let's now continue with our moderator, Javier Blas.
Minister Cardenas, you moved from the Ministry of Energy to the Ministry of Finance at the absolutely wrong time. So how has been your experience dealing with the financial, the budgetary, and the economic consequences of the drop in oil prices? At least your benefit is that coffee prices are still doing very well.
Which is very important, by the way, because we have 600,000 families that live out of coffee production, and for them, prices have remained high. But that's more related to the production in Brazil that was affected by a drought, so that has kept prices relatively high. But on the issue of oil, just to put this in context, Colombia now produces about 1 million barrels of oil per day. But that hasn't always been the case. It's only in the last 6 years that we entered, I'd say not the big leagues, but the 1 million barrels puts us in about the 20th position in the world in terms of production. Oil production and oil exports are important from the point of view of our external accounts, the balance of payments, and the fiscal accounts. They're less relevant in terms of GDP, because it's only about 5% of our GDP, essentially because it's a relatively recent phenomenon. And Colombia has a relatively more diversified economy than other oil-producing countries. We always thought that high oil prices were temporary. We didn't know exactly when prices were going to fall and how fast. I have to say that they have fallen in a very short period of time, and no one knew for sure when was that going to happen. But we knew that we had to be prepared. And in order to be prepared, we introduced in our constitution and in our legislation 2 major initiatives in the last 4 years. One is a change in the royalties system. Royalties in Colombia, essentially from oil, go directly to the regions, not to the national government. And in the constitutional reform, we forced savings from those royalties. And that's why we have a buffer now of about $3 billion that we can use in the future to stabilize revenues for the regions. That's very important. Forced savings since we changed the constitution in terms of the royalty system. And in the case of the national government, we have a fiscal rule. And the fiscal rule forces us to reduce the structural deficit of the national government. That's the long-term deficit, which is based on potential output and the long-term price of oil. But it's not for us in the national government to decide what is the long-term price of oil. It's for an independent body that sets that price. And that gives us some space to accommodate to the loss in revenues as a result in the reduction of oil prices. About 15% of our revenues in the national government come from the taxes that oil companies pay and from the dividends that we get from a state-owned oil company, Ecopetrol. But we can accommodate with our fiscal rule because the rule gives us some time to adjust to the new oil prices. So the way we think about this is overall good for the world. It has benefits in terms of making the world a stronger economy and stronger growth. But of course, it means challenges for countries that produce and export oil like us. But it could also be thought as a blessing in disguise, because for a country like Colombia, with a diversified economy, with a strong manufacturing sector, strong agricultural sector, services, the appreciation of our currency in the last decade was a major challenge. It put a lot of sectors under risk. They had difficulties in remaining competitive. And now we're seeing that with a weaker exchange rate, with a more competitive environment, these sectors can now take the lead and become the ones that grow the fastest in the next future, in the next couple of years. So that's essentially the way we're approaching this. We think it's the time for other sectors in our economy to take the lead, as I said, and show greater growth rates. And I'll just finish with a comment on energy subsidies. I know that the IMF and many others are advocating for taking advantage of this situation to eliminate or reduce energy subsidies in those countries that have it. I have to say that Colombia is a very exceptional case because despite the fact that we're important oil producers, we always have remained a country that taxes fossil fuels. So we have taxes that are even higher than the ones that exist here in the United States. So it's not the case that we'll take this as an opportunity to reduce subsidies, because on the contrary, we have always been a country that taxes domestic consumption of fossil fuels.
Thank you so much, Minister. One very brief question. What is that long-term price that you were mentioning earlier?
Well, that's an interesting question. The independent body says we're not in the business of forecasting oil prices. We're in the business of giving you the input so you make smart fiscal decisions. And they have decided that the best way to do that is use a moving average that looks 4 years back, 4 years into the future, and the current year. And based on that moving average, we get the long-term price of oil, which means that if prices remain where they are now, in 4 years, the current prices will be the permanent prices.
Okay.
As we've just heard from Mr. Cardenas of Colombia, his country introduced some buffers because they did not expect oil prices to stay high way into the future. These are again salient points from Mr. Cardenas with lessons for political leaders in Africa. Let us now hear from Mohamed Laksaki, Governor of the Central Bank of Algeria.
Governor Lasaki, you have been for a long time at the central bank. You have been a distinguished economist there for more than 3 decades, actually. You have seen the ups and downs. How is this time affecting the drop in oil prices? A country that is still very dependent on hydrocarbons, both oil and let's not forget, Algeria may not be the world's largest oil producer, but in natural gas, it is one of the largest players. So that combination of low gas prices and low oil prices, what is the impact in Algeria?
Thank you. As an oil exporter, Algeria has been substantially impacted by the recent drastic oil decline. The impact has been essentially felt on the balance of payment, but also on public finances, which is highly dependent on hydrocarbon revenue. Following 7 years of surplus, the current account of the balance of payment recorded a deficit last year. Consequently, the resulting balance of payment deficit, the first deficit for 14 consecutive years, led to a contraction in international reserve following a long period of sustained reserve accumulation. With regard to public finances, the deficit recorded by the budget since 2009, notably on account of the strong progression of current and capital spending, deepened last year further. This led to a contraction in the resource of stabilization fund. Here again, for the first time after several consecutive years of saving accumulations. And budgetary saving accumulation amounted to 25% of GDP by end of last year. I think that the oil price fall should also have a negative impact on banking liquidity as of 2015. The decline in hydrocarbon export revenue should lead to a contraction in the excess liquidity, which has characterized the money market since 2002. This shed the light on the prospect of near return of the banking sector to the refinancing window of the central bank, and also the reactivation of these channels in the conduct of our monetary policy. The oil price shock should not have a negative impact on growth, on short-term economic growth. In last year, non-hydrocarbon growth reached 5% and should record a similar path this year. And this is to a large extent on the amount of continued public investment. Regarding inflation, inflation remained under control last year at 3% and should be kept under 4% this year. And the annual average was around 4% between 2002 and 2014. Let's say that despite the magnitude of this external shock, the resilience of Algerian economy remains strong. The higher net external financial position reflects a higher international reserves, more than 30 months of import of goods and services, as well as an historically low external debt, around 3% of GDP. In addition, as I said, despite a decline, the resource of the stabilization fund, which is the budgetary savings, remains substantial. As I said, 25% of GDP. Given that oil prices are generally expected to remain low for a prolonged period, the degree of resilience of our economy may rapidly erode which requires macroeconomic adjustment to ensure medium-term fiscal sustainability while preserving progress spending and reform actions geared toward economic diversification, job creation, and inclusion. As for public finances, the availability of important budgetary savings helped avoid sharp spending cuts and envisage with serenity measures to be taken to ensure ordinary and gradual fiscal consolidation. In this context, a supplementary budget law is under preparation and should focus on investment spending rationalization, notably through better prioritizing of investment,
Since I looked at this issue the first time, crude oil prices have remained down. As discussed in the IMF and World Bank seminar debate, the severe and swift decline in oil and other commodity prices has had varying impacts and extensive implications for oil importers, exporters, consumers, and governments. The highly variable effects of the oil price drop have created some winners and losers. The economies that have been hit the hardest appear to be some of the biggest oil exporters, such as Russia and OPEC countries, which are heavily reliant on oil revenues to fund their government expenditures. In countries like Nigeria, the whole economy has been terribly impacted since crude oil exports account for over 90% of the nation's foreign exchange earnings. And without diversification, the Nigerian economy has not been able to produce much of its importables and therefore will continue to be buffeted by activities in the crude oil industry. For Nigeria, an immediate relief without cost from economic turmoil at this time will come from a steady rise of oil prices. There is no other easy solution. The only other short-term option to save the economy now is for the government to borrow, even though Nigeria's debt service as a percent of revenue is high. Nigeria's total debt as a percent of GDP, around 13%, is low, but it is unimportant. What is important is the nation's debt service as a percent of revenue. For Nigeria at over 30%, this is high and will continue as a problem so long as oil prices stay historically low. So when will it all end? It will end when oil prices rise again. Now, even Nostradamus might not have been able to know the answer to this. I once did currency forecasting for a living. So what do I see for the Naira? Well, that discussion is too long for this segment. But as far as oil prices are concerned, I believe there will start to be a tick-up when a couple of things begin to happen. 1, OPEC members stop worrying about market share and start focusing more on prices. 2, the US dollar eases a bit from being too strong. And 3, the industrialized economies of Europe, North America, and even China begin to regain good health. When you see these things happening, then it means oil prices are starting to rise again. Before then, as we insist here at the EBS, build the economies of your communities, and the national economy will be diversified. With that, who needs much crude oil? Anyway, I'm Magnus Kpakol, and that's my view.
At